So welcome back to week 5 of our course on forced and precarious labour in the global economy. In this week, I want to take up and extend some of the themes that Sam talked about last week, and that's the issues associated with the exploitation and vulnerability of migrant workers and their role within global economic systems. So last week you heard from Sam about the problems associated with migration and migrant work. In this week, I want to kind of take some of what Sam has said and begin to reflect upon some of the ways in which different solutions, strategies, or ways of organizing might be adopted in order to approve the legal rights and workplace protections that are afforded to migrant workers in various countries. So I want to do two things in this session. The first is to provide a bit of an analysis of some of the problems and complications associated with one of the most popular responses to migration and exploitation. And that is the impulse, kind of stirred and supported by racism and xenophobia, to prevent all forms of migration and mobility at the border. And this is a very popular strategy, not necessarily motivated by humanitarian impulses, but it's nonetheless something that governments and others turn to when faced with problems associated with migration and exploitation. Stop people moving. So in the first half, we're going to have a bit of a think about some of the complications and limitations associated with this established policy and practice. And then in the second half, we're going to think a little bit more deeply about some of the alternative strategies which might be adopted or contemplated when it comes to a more effective response to the problems associated with migration and exploitation. So that's our kind of mandate for this week. I just also, at this juncture, want to briefly recap some of the key themes that Sam will have discussed with you last week. So I would hope that you would recall that governments, corporations, and others are often very invested in having people move for the purposes of work. Migrants fill jobs, they grow crops, they provide care in nursing and hospitals, they build stadiums, and so on and so forth. So this whole idea that governments are automatically and inexorably opposed to migrants misses the fact that in a lot of cases, governments and various economic interests are actually really invested in having people move for the purposes of work. The problem, of course, as Sam outlined, is the terms on which they move are attractive because they're terms that leave them vulnerable to various forms of exploitation. So, migration good, but migrant workers are only valuable within this calculus because the protections that are afforded to them are limited, and the work on which they provide is not paid at the same rate as workers in the communities within which they reside. So this is the fundamental dilemma. In terms of how responses to this issue take place, the first point we have to think about is this impulse to stop people at the border. Now, I'm not going to pretend that the impulse to stop people at the border arises out of some noble humanitarian sentiment. As Sam has outlined, it's the underlying sources of racism and xenophobia and a fear of outsiders and others, which are often the main animating impulse or purpose behind efforts at border protection. However, it's still important to grapple with the humanitarian argument because it's an argument which is frequently given by government officials throughout the globe as part of the reason why border protections might be necessary. So when President Donald Trump proclaimed an executive order regarding his commitment to build a wall, one of the justifications he gave for the wall was to prevent human trafficking. Now, this prevention of human trafficking rationale is not distinctive to Trump's wall, but it's also something that European politicians have invoked repeatedly in relation to the recent crisis in the Mediterranean. So when it comes to preventing people moving from Africa and the Middle East to Europe, there's been a recurring tendency to run together the terms people smuggling and people trafficking. And by running together these terms of smuggling and trafficking, there's been a broader argument that says that highly aggressive and punitive measures to stop human traffickers are foundational to an humanitarian mission and not simply a punitive and protectionist one. So a good example of this comes from the Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi, who declared that human traffickers are the slave traders of the 21st century and that they need to be brought to justice. So in this formula, which the Italians, the Spanish, the French, the British, and others are all very keen on, smuggling and trafficking get run together. Trafficking becomes a moral cause or problem which requires border protection. And as a consequence of this need for border protection, now cloaked in humanitarian language and rhetoric, all kinds of highly punitive measures have been adopted to prevent people from Africa and the Middle East from entering into Europe. And this isn't something that begins at the Mediterranean. It also extends through the auspices of Frontex and other initiatives into places like Libya and Niger, where Europeans are heavily invested in preventing all forms of movement. Now, it may well be that there's an argument for preventing movement, but it's not an argument that works in any kind of humanitarian terms. We know throughout history that movement is a natural human condition, and that we know from extensive research that what happens in response to initiatives like Trump's wall or the European border fortress is that they raise the costs and challenges associated with migration without necessarily preventing migration in the first place. So what we find repeatedly is that border protection makes people vulnerable, but doesn't prevent people from moving in the first place. And this is in part because migration remains, as it always has been, one of the great strategies for seeking to escape poverty, conformity, or many other kind of limitations and constraints that people find in their home communities. So migration is something that in a lot of cases represents an avenue or a strategy. It's not something that can be easily controlled or tamed through an army of drones or the building of additional walls or the cracking down in various militarized ways on ships and movements and so on and so forth. So when it comes to migration and exploitation, we cannot accept the idea that preventing movement is a humanitarian impulse. It instead arises out of xenophobic and racist impulses in a lot of cases, and it's also unlikely to be effective when push comes to shove. So if the dominant and conventional approach isn't going to work, what might we instead contemplate in terms of alternative strategies and approaches?